Hi everyone. Teng Boo again from Capital Dynamics. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, please do. We have a wide range of very interesting topics with a lot of interesting comments as well. So please subscribe, please share and like. And of course, do not forget to send in your comments. So for today, our topic is interesting. Whether America should still be a global leader or whether America should retire as a global leader. I hope you will stay true with us. It's a bit longer than my usual recording because it's a big topic and I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. So bear with me and enjoy. So let's watch, for the beginning, let's watch two videos. The first video is a congressional hearing of a few of the AI companies, internet companies, and the one that we are particularly concerned with, I think has gone viral in many parts of the world, is where Republican Tim Cotton grilled the CEO of TikTok. And the second is a video of Nancy Pelosi responding to the anti-Israel Gaza crisis. Some of the protesters who were protesting that the whole thing is a genocide. Let's watch the videos.
So, you said today, as you often say, that you live in Singapore. Of what nation are you a citizen?
Singapore.
Are you a citizen of any other nation?
No, Senator.
Have you ever applied for Chinese citizenship?
Senator, I served my nation in Singapore. No, I did not.
Do you have a Singaporean passport?
Yes, and I served my military for two and a half years in Singapore.
Do you have any other passports from any other nations?
No, Senator.
Your wife is an American citizen. Your children are American citizens.
That's correct.
Have you ever applied for American citizenship?
No, not yet.
Okay. Have you ever been a member of the Chinese Communist Party?
Senator, I'm Singaporean. No.
Have you ever been associated or affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party?
No, Senator. Again, I'm Singaporean.
Let me ask you some hopefully simple questions.
Okay, that was the so-called grilling of Mr. Chiu by Tim Cotton. Let's watch the second video.
Yeah, well, things got kind of testy for Nancy Pelosi yesterday when she was confronted outside of her home by protesters demanding a ceasefire in Gaza. Let's get right into it.
Most of your constituents want stop the genocide, stop the Holocaust.
The Democrats want the ceasefire. The Democrats want the ceasefire.
Now, in case you didn't catch that, she said, go back to China where your headquarters is. That's just a day after accusing pro-ceasefire protesters of being Putin's puppets.
I'm not sure what you make out of these two videos. Is it racist or is it arrogance, typical arrogance of American politician? Let me just share with you something which I think I would be very certain many of you are not aware of. It's a bit of American history, and I'll run through some of the past American presidents and what they have said about matters relating to race. So the first one we will look at is Thomas Jefferson. He's the third US president from 1801 to 1809. And many of you would think very highly of him because he was supposed to have promoted the idea that all men are created equal. And this phrase has been quoted by so many people without knowing its real meaning, right? At that time, Thomas Jefferson owned 150 to 175 slaves. And by the time Jefferson died, he owned 200 slaves. All men are created equal? In his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson wrote, "They," meaning the blacks, "are at least as brave and more adventuresome. But this may perhaps proceed from a want of forethought. The blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the white in the endowments of both body and mind." Right? His ideas became useful for the Americans to institutionalize slavery. Right? Then what about Jefferson? Thomas Jefferson, pushing the US Congress to pass the Slave Trade Act of 1807. This was more than 200 years ago. Right? He closed the US participation in international slave trade, but he cleverly opened the door and set the stage for domestic slave trade in America. Let's take a look at the next president, James Monroe. Many of you may know him as the person who formulated the Monroe Doctrine. This is what he's famous for, right? And this foreign policy basically says that the affairs of the Americas, meaning North America, Latin America, South America, would be forbidden to any European interference. America is only for the Americans. Can you imagine if we say Asia is only for Asians? Why can't we say that? So, in reality, this Monroe Doctrine became an excellent rationalization for North America or United States intervention in Latin and South America, right? Beginning with the annexation of a large part of Mexico in 1840. The underlying principle of this Monroe Doctrine is racist condescension, a prevailing assumption among US policymakers at the time that the Latin and South Americans are viewed as unruly children in need of discipline and direction, and could not function without the paternalistic oversight and supervision from the whites in the United States. Let's take another one. Andrew Jackson, 7th President, 1829 to 1837. The father of America's Democratic Party and supposed champion of the common man. Of course, he defined common man only of a certain color. But he is more well known as the Indian killer. Why? 1 year after he started as US President, he signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, about 200 years ago, forcing more than 46,000 Native Americans to move out of their homelands and send them marching westwards in order to create space for white settlers. This journey, known as the Trail of Tears, left thousands of Native Americans dead along the way due to cold, hunger, and disease. The soldier, a Georgian soldier who was involved in that transfer, said, "I fought through the war between the states, the Civil War, and have seen many men shot, but the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work I ever knew." What about the fourth one? James Polk, the 11th US President, 1845 to 1849. Only one term, but he is well remembered for expanding the territorial size of US in an aggressive, violent, and imperial manner. Right? He believed fervently that the US was fated to expand across the North American continent. This is known as the Manifest Destiny. He declared the Mexican-American War, which lasted for 2 years, And this war saw Mexico losing 530 square miles of territory to the United States and giving up claims to disputed territory in Texas. I mean, not counting the thousands of Mexican and American soldiers that died. Just how big is 530,000 square miles? Thailand has about 198,000 square miles. Malaysia, 127,000 square miles. Myanmar, 261,000 square miles. Thailand, Malaysia, Myanmar combined is about 186,000 square miles. So under James Polk, imagine, America conquered the equivalent of Myanmar, Thailand, and Malaysia. And he's also reignited the debate of the extension of slavery into the newly colonized American territories. And this debate that James Polk reignited eventually caused America's Civil War. Andrew Johnson, 17th President, 1865 to 1869. He supported the end of slavery, but unfortunately, he was still a white supremacist. In 1866, he wrote, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." Next. Chester Arthur, 21st President, 1881 to 1885. This was the president who signed the Chinese Exclusion Act in May 1882, prohibiting all immigration of Chinese into the United States. Right? And I mean, this was the first act that targeted a single race. This was the first act that you can find anywhere in the world that made race its target. And this Chinese Exclusion Act lasted for quite a long time. Next. William McKinley, 25th President. He was the one who decided to conquer Philippines. Right? The Philippines, of course, previously was under the Spanish, did not recognize the American right of possession. While the Filipinos expected independence, just as the other former Spanish colonies had done, William McKinley thought that the Filipinos were unfit for government, for self-government, and wanted to uplift and civilize and Christianize the Filipinos. That is why Christianity is so entrenched in the Philippines. No thanks to William McKinley, who had this mission to Christianize the Filipinos. And he authorized a brutal war against the Filipino revolutionaries. This Philippine-American War lasted for 3 years, and more than 200,000 Filipinos died from violence, famine, and disease. And that is why, up to now, the American influence in the Philippines is still deeply entrenched. Next. Woodrow Wilson, 28th President, he undermined racial equality at every turn. He backed what is known as the Ku Klux Klan. Ku Klux Klan is a white supremacist group in America, right? He refused to appoint black ambassadors to Haiti or the Dominican Republic. And as Huffington Post explained, at the Versailles Convention settling World War I in 1919, President Wilson effectively killed Japan's proposal for a treaty recognizing racial equality, thus sustaining European colonialism throughout the world. Next. Calvin Coolidge, 1923 to 1929. Basically, there was these great floods one of the worst natural disasters in US history. The white people were quickly hauled to safety, while the blacks were stranded on top of the dikes, forced to work in poor conditions for their rations, and given lesser and lower quality food than the whites. Adding to his racism, Calvin Coolidge also signed the Immigration Act of 1924. What does this act do? It limits immigrants from countries believed to have inferior stock. People like you and me, this type of color. Inferior stock means people who are from Southern Europe and Asia. And Coolidge, like many other American presidents before him, stated very simply, America should be kept American. Biological laws show that Nordics deteriorate when mixed with other races. You cannot get more racist than that. Next. Ronald Reagan, modern times. I'm jumping because there's so many of them. I just picked about 10 of them. Ronald Reagan opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights of 1965. America only had reached a stage of one person, one vote only in 1965. There was no such thing as one person, one vote when America was born, and the women had to fight for it, and the blacks had to fight for it. So Ronald Reagan opposed Civil Rights Act, opposed the Voting Rights Act, and Ronald Reagan believed in white supremacy. He supported he supported the South African apartheid. So I think, when you do things like that, you cannot be more racist than this. So what you heard from Tim Cotton earlier in present day, in the modern 21st century, what you heard from Nancy Pelosi, their racist, their arrogant words, their arrogant attitude, their racist attitude, has a long history in America, in United States. It goes back to their very early days of the United States of America. But the video of Mr. Chiu and Nancy Pelosi is not just about arrogance and racism. It's a lot deeper than that. It's a lot more dangerous than that. McCarthyism, which was a period in the 50s where a lot of innocent Americans were suspected of being communists. For no reason, without evidence, you were suspected as a communist, and therefore you face the punishment. So McCarthyism resulted in many tragedies in the 50s and the 60s, and millions of innocent people in Asia, not in America, in Asia, was killed because of this McCarthyism movement, which in a way is being repeated now, except that people don't seem to recognize it. So my take is this: what you see, the attitudes being expressed by Tim Cotton and Nancy Pelosi, is basically about attacking China. Anti-China is an anti-China sentiment. It is about preventing China from succeeding economically. My take is very simple. China's political system and model and cultural values are different from the West. Of course, with 5,000 years of history, it is different. But this does not mean that China, with her political system, her culture, her model, is a threat to anyone, although the Western politicians and the Western media would want you to think so, would want you to believe so. Western democracies like Great Britain, the United States, France, and others have committed some of the worst atrocities in human history. From my research, Queen Victoria of Great Britain stands out in particular, partly because of her long reign and partly because the British Empire was at its biggest, at its peak, and therefore a lot of atrocities were committed across so many countries, so many geographies all over the world. Let's hear from Anthony Masella. He's professor of psychology at University of Hawaii. For those of you who are not familiar, Anthony J. Masella is a well-known psychologist, is a well-known professor, and let's take a listen to what he has written. He has written in 2011 this article called "The United States of America: A Culture of War." This was in 2011. Now let me just very quickly run through one or two of the sentences what he's trying to say. He says that the evidence shows that the United States meets all the qualifications to be considered an empire, specifically a global empire seeking hegemonic economic, political, and cultural control of the world. This evidence includes a worldwide system of military bases, an extensive military, industrial, congressional complex that shapes domestic and foreign policies and actions, and an extensive national security system that now endangers and threatens the legal rights of its own American citizens. At the core of the US pursuit of empire is a historic commitment to the beliefs in manifest destiny. Remember, I earlier mentioned manifest destiny, and the belief in American exceptionalism. This process and the consequence of much of this, according to Professor Masella, are rooted in the existence of a US culture of war. And this culture of war dominates US domestic and foreign policies and their destructive implementation across the world. I think Professor Masella has wrote very well, has described it very well, and it is hard, it is almost impossible for anyone to disagree with him. But it's not just Professor Masella. A lot of other learned Americans have reached the same conclusion. This book, Anatomy of Failure, Why America Loses Every War It Starts, by Harlan K. Ullman. Let me just quote him. Few Americans are even aware of or concerned over how long this nation has been engaged in armed conflict over recent decades. It is quite a staggering length of time for a country that prides itself on its exceptionalism and its peaceful efforts to spread democracy around the globe. The most worrying possibility is that this propensity to start wars and use force for the wrong reasons may now be deeply embedded in the nation's DNA, or what Professor Masella calls it as a culture of war. Let me just quote Ullman again. He added, in identifying and dissecting reasons for these failures, the failures of America when they start wars, we ask, why over the past decades have successful American administration of both parties, Republicans and Democrats, despite asserting that force was a last resort, too often turned to force as the first resort of policy, ignoring or marginalizing other tools of government. Basically, it's the same. It's the culture of war that has been embedded in the United States. So it's not just racism, it's not just arrogance. Now, I quote you something that I wrote in the iCapital some time back. I said that US officials were aiming at 10 key sectors identified by China in the Made in China 2025 plan. These included robotics, aerospace, maritime and modern rail equipment, EV, and so on. In addition to tariffs, America under Trump has imposed new restrictions on Chinese investments in similar sectors. Robert Lighthizer, special advisor to Trump, warned that the US cannot afford a situation where China can go out and buy US technology in a variety of ways that are troubling to America. Mr. Lighthizer told a US congressional hearing that these are the things that if China dominates, it's bad for the world. Gosh, my goodness, that's worrying. It's bad for the world. But my question is, how can this be? China has dominated so many technologies in her long history, and she has never invaded any other countries. If the world during the time of the booming Silk Road, whether it's overland or maritime, had followed Lighthizer anti-China policy, Europe and the United States would still be living in dark ages now. China at that time was the world's largest economy with the most advanced science and technology, as well as superior and proven public government, civil bureaucracy. Europe and later on United States immensely benefited from the sharing of China's material, educational, political, and cultural wealth. So I'm not sure who is the aggressor, who is the defender. So like what Professor Anthony Masala says, let me quote him again, the United States must establish itself as a culture of peace by pursuing a new set of cultural ethos. I'm not sure whether Biden is listening. I'm not sure whether Trump is listening, but they should listen, because the world would be a much better place. The world would be a more peaceful and prosperous place. A lot of times, this arrogance, this wanting to be hegemonic and the only superpower in the world comes from a lot of ignorance about other countries, other cultures, other people. Let me quote Professor Eric Schwartzel-Jebel. He's a famous professor. I'm sorry if I cannot pronounce his name correctly, but he said, now, the dominant academic culture in the United States traces back to Britain and Europe, and due to cultural ignorance and arrogance, the ancient philosophers like Confucius, Lao Tzu, and all that were not taught, and therefore were not read by succeeding American generations. What does that mean? This Professor Eric says, ignorance thus apparently justifies ignorance. Because we do not know their work, they have little impact on our philosophy. Because they have little impact on our philosophy, we believe we are justified in remaining ignorant about their work. This justification of ignorance is not only seen in Trump and Biden and their teams, but across almost every American politician, from Pelosi to Rubio to Schumer and many more, including Tim Cotton. They do not even know what they do not know. That is the scary part. That is scary because America wants to be still the global leader. America does not want to retire as the global leader. Let me just share with you some shocking examples of their ignorance. And this ignorance at a high level of the so-called learned Americans, right? America has a Supreme Court judge called Antonin Scalia. Antonin Scalia was one of the most influential conservative justices in US history and was the longest serving justice on the US Supreme Court. Now, he expressed a common misconception about Chinese philosophy. It's not just misconception, it was a common insult of the Chinese philosophy. He described Chinese philosophy as mystical aphorisms of fortune cookies. Scalia went to denigrate Chinese philosophy as nothing but poetry or inspirational pop philosophy that lacks logic and precision. You know, Antonin Scalia, for whatever you are, whoever you are, you pass judgment on something that you have not even begin to understand or understood. Scalia doesn't even know that fortune cookies are not Chinese. What an idiot he is. Right? Chinese philosophy is rich in persuasive argumentation and careful analysis. It just presents its theories and conclusions using a framework different to Western philosophy. So you have a situation where the learned Americans, whether in the political side, in this case, in the legal, in the judicial system, are ignorant and arrogant. And yet they want to tell you that they are right and we are wrong. That's not acceptable. If you look at history, in 1949, after World War II, America by then had already wanted to destroy a weak and poor but still very proud China. Whether it is through Truman, President Eisenhower, Johnson, President Kennedy, Ford, Clinton, the two Bushes, President Obama, Trump or Biden, America's major foreign policy has always been anti-China. Do you know that when the Communist Party took over in 1949, America had embargoes and sanctions against PRC that are even worse than what Trump and Biden have done to China now. At that time, China was so weak, China was so poor, China was not in a position to attack anyone. China had only organized its navy only in 1950, and there was hardly any warships inside there. So my question is, America, United States of America, why do you want to destroy China all the time? Whether it is under the Communist Party of China, whether it's under the Qing dynasty, why do you always want to destroy China? Why do you think that you are always right? You know, let me just explain to you what my purpose is for this session. It's actually very straightforward and simple. We, not just the Chinese, but Asia in general, have been brainwashed by Western propaganda and the media for too long a period. This brainwashing is so serious and so destructive that we always take whatever the BBC, the CNN, the New York Times, the Economist write or say as gospel truth. We assume that what America or the West does is always right. That what China and the Communist Party of China or what Xi Jinping does is always wrong. The scariest part is many of us do not know that we have been brainwashed by these Western media and entities. We must ask ourselves, right? We cannot get this narrative, a one-sided narrative, that the West is always good, that Communist China is always bad. This kind of mindset is dangerous because if we don't get rid of it, we will never be able to achieve sustainable world peace. You want to accuse me of anything, whatever label you want to put on me, that's fine. My question is, does the West, led by the United States, have a monopoly on what is right? That is my question. And that is what those two videos, to bring you back to the Mr. Chiu video and the Pelosi video. American politicians as a whole do not understand the Chinese psyche. The Chinese psyche is this: they do not blame US, Japan, Europe for being strong. The Chinese blame themselves for being weak and want to make sure that they do not repeat such mistakes ever again. To make sure that these mistakes don't repeat, they need to reunite, to rebuild, and to reinvigorate, rejuvenate China and the Chinese people. A strong China in this context does not translate into an aggressive and expansionist China. This is where the American politicians and their policymakers and advisors have gotten China totally wrong, either out of sheer ignorance or intentionally, or both. This is to show you how insulting it was even a long time ago. President Truman did not take Chairman Mao seriously, even though Chairman Mao had massive support from the people in China. President Truman called Mao Zedong disparagingly as Mao Zedong. It cannot be more insulting than that. And then Zhou Enlai, this was in the 50s, when he extended his hand to the US Secretary of State, Dulles. Dulles turned his back, refused to shake it, and walked away. It was an astonishing display of disrespect by Dulles. I quoted that from a book written by Michael Pembroke. Michael Pembroke was a Supreme Court judge in Australia. And this book is called The Korean War, written by Michael Pembroke. It's a brilliant book. You have to read it to understand not only the Korean War, because from there you can understand what is happening to China and US relations in the current days, in contemporary times. Let me just share another quote from another conversation from another American president, Jimmy Carter. He was having a talk with Trump when Trump just became president, right, in Georgia. The conversation between the two came after Jimmy Carter wrote to Donald Trump offering advice on US-China relations. Carter said Trump told him he was particularly concerned about how China is getting ahead of America, right? And that Carter agreed with the US president on this particular point. But Carter asked Trump, do you know why I normalized diplomatic relations with China in 1979? Since 1979, do you know how many times China has been at war with anybody? None. And we have stayed at war. This is from President Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter described the United States as the most warlike nation in the history of the world due to its desire to impose American values on other countries. You heard the investigation, the query of Cotton or Mr. Chiu. Mr. Chiu keeps saying, I'm Singaporean, I'm Singaporean. What the heck? The way he talks is like this Singapore is a tiny village in China. Wow. So Carter says China was investing resources into infrastructure projects like high-speed railroads instead of defense spending. Carter asked Trump, how many miles of high-speed railroad do we have in this country? And Carter says we have wasted, I think, $3 trillion US. China has not wasted a single penny on war. And that's why China is ahead of America in almost every way. And I think the difference is if you take $3 trillion US and put it into American infrastructure, you probably would have $2 trillion left over. We, meaning America, would have high-speed railroad, bridges that are not collapsing. We would have roads that are maintained properly. America would have education system that would be as good as, for example, South Korea or Hong Kong. That is from Jimmy Carter. Right? I mean, he's a modern, a very recent American president in the 1979-1980, giving advice to Donald Trump. Obviously, Donald Trump did not pay any attention to what Jimmy Carter told him, and more importantly is Joe Biden has also not listened to the advice. That is why America is fighting so many wars in so many places. That is why America's military spending is the largest in the world, equivalent to the next 9 countries combined in total. And it's going to reach $1 trillion US very soon. And that is why the US economy faces a federal deficit of $1.7 trillion US in fiscal year 2023. In fiscal year 2024, which ends in September 30th, 2024, America's fiscal deficit most likely will go up to $2 trillion US, and America's public debt would be more than 120% of America's GDP. So like I said at the beginning, the 2 videos where you see Tim Cotton grilling Mr. Chiu of TikTok and Nancy Pelosi responding to the pro-ceasefire protesters, it's not racist. Of course, they single out China, Communist Party of China, and so on. That on the surface may be seen as racist. It is a lot deeper than that, because that racist attitude, that racist behavior, that racist sentiment, that anti-China sentiment is entrenched in American history. It goes back a long way. Not just under the Communist Party of China. For those of you who are not familiar with the history, please read your history, because America, even when China was under the Qing dynasty that had not a single element of communism, America was already all out to either plunder China's wealth. Of course, America was engaged in the opium trade. A lot of the American famous Ivy League universities got their money from making wealth, a lot of riches from China's opium trade, and also to Christianize the whole country, and also to divide China among UK, Britain, and the European powers, and Japan, and Russia at that time. So that has always been America's aim. Robert McNamara, the US Defense Secretary during the Vietnam War under President Johnson, in a private memorandum, said that the aim of America in entering Vietnam War, the real aim was to contain China. So there you go. It's not racism. It is wanting to be maintaining your empire, wanting to be maintaining yourself as the global leader. But with a history of ignorance, with a history of arrogance, with a history of very racist type of beliefs, I think it's time for America to retire. The world would be a better place if America retires as a global leader. To end my talk today, let me just share with you a personal experience. It's quite hilarious. I was in San Francisco in November 2019. I stayed in Intercontinental San Francisco. So, of course, the hotel was just trying to be nice, trying to be very pro-customer and so on. But as you can see, the ignorance, the arrogance, no matter what you want to describe it, Intercontinental welcomes Boo Tan Teng. Hey, who the hell is Boo Tan Teng? I'm their loyal, I'm on their, at that time, I'm at the highest level of their, the loyalty membership, at the highest level. And they call me Boo Tan Teng. My goodness, I do not know whether to laugh or to feel so deeply insulted. So it shows itself, right? The ignorance, the arrogance, whatever you want to call it, it shows itself at all levels of the American society. So my simple conclusion is, I think it is time. It is time. It is an excellent time for America to stop acting like a global leader. I hope you have stayed throughout. I hope you have learned a few things here and there. And like I said, I did a lot of deep research across many areas. If I were to present all the things I've researched and discovered, I think my talk would probably last a few days. There's so much material. So I'm trying to simplify and summarize them as effectively as I can. Share, as usual, share this with your friends, with whoever you know, comment, and don't forget to subscribe to www.icapital.biz. A lot of the things that I have shared with you today can be found in our publication iCapital. All the archives that we have, all the issues that were written years ago, once you become a subscriber, online subscriber, you get access to all the archives. So with that, I thank you again and have a good weekend.